Well, my family's Pembrokeshire history started in Tenby in 1843. This was a time when there was disputes about agricultural land and practice. And so my father Richard fell out with his father up in Herefordshire and brought his new wife to Tenby, where he bought the business of Hoff and Company, printers and publishers. Initially he started off printing, publishing, and with a lending library for the new incoming tourist field to Tenby. Then but by 1853 he got the idea of publishing a weekly newspaper, the Tenby Observer, which he promptly got going, and then he moved on from there to become after the loss of the Prince Consort, Prince Albert, he became the secretary of the Welsh National Appeal to build the monument to Prince Albert, which is on the hill in Tenby and an icon of Wales to this day. So, and he is the representative of the appeal that was called to receive the personal thanks of Queen Victoria. He and Elizabeth Davenport, his wife, had, I think, 10 children. The boys, as far as I can see, and the school records are indistinct on this, but the boys all went away to Llandovery College to school, and then the eldest boy became a doctor and practiced in London and Ramsgate. The second became a barrister and became a colonial judge. The third one got killed in the Indian Army. The fourth one, Arthur Henry, qualified as a civil engineer and was an early builder of Indian railways, and he, in fact, he was professor of engineering at Calcutta University when he was 39, which wasn't bad. And the fifth one, Frank B. Mason, became the lasting element to Pembrokeshire, because he made his name with a company of estate agents and the Tenby Observer and various other enterprises, and he was also part owner of the fishery industry in Tenby. He was also responsible for the introduction of the bathing machines into Tenby, and I understand, achieved quite a record of life saving. So the family lived at that stage, by the time I was born anyway, and for some, and really from late in the 19th century, they lived in Northcliffe House, Tenby, which is a very large building, and in 1937, when I was a small boy, it was converted into, because it was the largest site in Tenby, into Woolworths, and it's Tesco's, I think, today, the ground floor. That was because it had entrances on 3 sides, which was very rare in Tenby. How am I doing so far?
Okay, fine.
Okay, right. Well, life moved on. Now, we start the naval history in this in 2 ways. Now, first of all, in 1871, Arthur Henry and Frank Britton Mason were slung out at Llandovery because they nicked a train. You know the crossing at Llandovery. Well, they were boys in the school. Arthur Henry, the elder of the two in particular, was keen on railways, as proved by his subsequent career. And they knew the fireman and the engine driver stopped in the pub to have a pint when they were at Llandovery. So they slipped aboard the train, steamed it up past the college, and steamed it back again, for which they were duly slung out. And when they got back to Tenby, Frank B, whose side I know what happened, my grandfather, his father said to him, "Well, what am I going to do with you now?" And he said, "Well, father, I think you better send me to sea." So his father said, "Well, you're overage for a cadetship in the Navy. I can't do that." So he said, "Well, no, father, but nevertheless, perhaps you could apprentice me to a shipping line." And so Frank B went to sea as a deck apprentice in the Merchant Navy, and he was a deck officer serving, I forget which ship, but he was on the west coast of the United States when his father died in 1881. And because his four elder brothers were all professionals in that sense, and he was perhaps more fluid, he was the one that was called back to run the affairs in Tenby. And of course, his name lives on, FBM, to this day in the county. He in turn had several sons, and I don't really remember any of them except my father, because they were all gone. The eldest, Frank B. Jr., died early following injuries he received in the Boer War. His second son, Richard, became the principal member of the family. He served in the Imperial Yeomanry in South Africa in the Boer War. He must have been a bit of an adventurer. He came back to Tenby, and then he joined the Yeomanry as a trooper, but he was a warrant officer. He was the youngest warrant officer they ever appointed, I think, up there. So I think he must have been a daredevil as well. Then he moved on, and he worked at the family businesses for a while, but I don't think that really suited him. So he went back to sea with the Royal Mail Lines, and he finally, when the war started, his first recorded matter was in Tenby, where he organised all the naval reservists, etc., and put them on the trains at the beginning of the First World War. I don't know much about his subsequent career, because he was commissioned in the RNVR, and he was quite senior at this stage, and he operated one of the fleet mail ships. Now, the fleet mail ships were converted liners that moved between Italy and Alexandria before the First World War, because it was a quicker route to get to India and things like that. So he carried on. He did have a break from this because he was sent to West Africa to be the prize master. The Navy had seized German ships, and he was prize master, and he brought those to the United Kingdom. And then he went back to Gallipoli, and his converted transport ship, if you like, HMS Osmanier, ferried replacement people around, being a liner. It not only carried the mail for the Mediterranean fleet, but it distributed it, and it used to pick up replacement seamen, replacement people all round. And he carried on. Then on Christmas Eve in 1917, he arrived off Alexandria with, I think, 400 nurses on board, something like that, brought out of Gallipoli. And he and the poor girls, well, the ship hit a mine within sight of Alexandria and went down. A lot of the girls were saved. But I do remember the late Graham Ace, who was a company commander in Egypt at the time. He had Ace's Motors in Tenby. Graham told me many years ago that his company had been given the job of picking up the girls off the beach, and it was one of the worst things he'd had to do in the whole of his life. One of the girls who came from Tenby recounted the story. I think Uncle Richard, of course, died. He went down with the ship, and he's on the war memorial in Hadra, in part of Alexandria, and that was it. Unfortunately, his son died the same year as a commando landing, as my father, in 1943, as a commando landing at Salerno. I suppose I'm getting a bit disjointed. Anyway, going back to the mainstream of the family. Oh yes, then there was another son whose memorial tablet in Tenby speaks for itself, I think. The one who was closest to my father in age, Uncle Henry Victor, and his memorial tablet in Tenby just says, Henry Victor Mason, Second Lieutenant Scots Guards, age 20. That's the First War. That's the First World War for you. I think their life expectancy in France was about 14 days, but I don't know. I do know how it happened. So my father, who was born in 1909, was the youngest inheritor, and the Tenby Observer had been, by this time, reserved for Uncle Henry, and although he was only 20, he had married in the desperation of going off to France, you know. So the poor girl, I think she just about might have had a honeymoon, but she inherited the Tenby Observer for the sake of that honeymoon anyway. My father, Jack Cosby, went to Dartmouth in the term of 1922 when he was 13, and he qualified and was promoted sub-lieutenant. Well, after being in many of the Second World War's famous battleships in the 1920s, like the Warspite and other ships we could mention. He left the Navy in the 1930s because he returned. They needed him at FBMs. In 1938, when I was a small boy, he was recalled a recall volunteer because the Navy were getting worried in the Munich crisis. But because he owned a business, they sent him home again afterwards. And then, I can remember him coming up the street, Tenby, and coming in 1939 and shouting, "You better pack my kit, I've got to go." And there we are. So that's how we got to that point. I had become a noticeable figure in 1939. In January, aged 6, I rode to the Meet of Hounds in Tudor Square, which my mother was most insistent that a gentleman should be able to sit a horse, but I didn't like it very much, I have to say. And she found out later when the groom told her that Master Tony doesn't really like the thing. I'm very sorry to hear he's fits, etc. And she said, "What do you mean fits?" "Oh, he goes into a bit of a trance at times." And it's dangerous to have him on the horse. It moved on from there. I suppose I should, disjointed, I should have mentioned that grandfather Frank B had fought. In 1906. Tenby Council took exception to the way the Observer reported the proceedings in the council and their commentary thereon. And so strangely for Tenby, the town clerk left that very night, and when they read it, for London to get an injunction from the High Court to stop the Observer publishing their proceedings. This was the beginning of the end of family fortune, in a sense, for us, because the costs of the action were tremendous. The Observer, I mean, you can find this document here, and I mean, the Observer lost. The High Court action came to, initial one came to an end. Judge Kekowicz, who was the brother of a man who defended, I think it was Lady Smith or one of the South African things, he died before he delivered his verdict, and so it all had to go through again. The costs, I believe, were in excess of £10,000 in 1908, which is about 1.4 million today, I'm told. And of course the Observer had to pay it because they'd lost the action. However, Parliament was in the background and they didn't like the verdict. And so as a result of my grandfather was able to crow because Parliament had decreed that in 1908 they passed an act called Local Authorities Admission of the Press Act, which said that you couldn't stop a local authority, you couldn't stop a newspaper reporting proceedings in the council and putting whatever slant on them they liked, you know. So that was freedom. So it was a matter of freedom of the press. This was quite venerated for probably the best part of 100 years. I mean, the anniversary of his Frank B's birth was the press of the Commonwealth came to Tenby to commemorate it. I remember it because the Navy gave me leave to go and attend and that sort of thing, by which time I was serving. Father died in Egypt on Epiphany, 6th of January 1943. He died essentially of gangrene. He'd been in the military hospital for quite a long time. Before being wounded, and that was the problem. He wasn't severely wounded at all, but he, in the desert, he had developed an infection which led to gangrene, and of course they only had sulfonamide drugs. They didn't have penicillin, and it took so from the commencement or the outset of the Battle of Alamein through to 6th of January is how long it took him to die. The death was inevitable because the surgeons had, I mean, I had letters and things, the surgeons had said that, you know, he would last. They'd cut away the bits, but he would last until the gangrene hit his brain, you know, and that was that. So a few months later, the son of his elder brother, Richard, died as a commando landing at Salerno, and the son. I'm not quite sure where it happened, but the only surviving brother of Frank B's children went to Canada because his sister had married out there, and he became nicknamed Calgary Ted because he was a Mountie in the Mounties. And I do remember as a boy Calgary Ted's son coming over with the Canadians during the war. And he also was lost in the Italian campaign. So the family paid a heavy price. Meanwhile, early on, in 1940, my father's first naval job had been to supervise the mine clearance operation, or the mine threat clearance operation, to get the new liner Queen Elizabeth out of the Clyde. And he'd been working up there. His next job was to do the same task at Barrow-in-Furness to get the new aircraft carrier Indomitable out of Barrow. Now, that didn't mean he drove the ship. That meant that he had to ensure that all the precautions and safety arrangements for it were in place so they could get it out. So we moved. At the time of Dunkirk, my mother, little brother and I were in transit to Barrow-in-Furness. And the first thing I noticed of the war then was we were on Crewe Station moving north when all these thousands of men had 330,000 men were rescued from the beaches, and they were mostly just put on trains and sent somewhere, you see. So of course Crewe Station was absolutely, the station buildings were festooned with men who didn't know where they were going and didn't really want to be there anyway, you know. And so that had happened. Tenby had been designated for an assembly point for the Belgian army, which is well documented, a reassembly point. We carried on when we managed to get transport to Barrow-in-Furness and established ourselves there. The winter of 1940, I remember, is pretty cold. I had been put into, for one reason or another, into a little pre-preparatory school as a weekly boarder, and then in the spring of 1941 my father's job substantially was over, and he and mother went off to south to look for a house for us for his next job, which was down on the south coast. So they were out of Barrow. My little brother Tim, age 5, was left at the school, in charge of the school matron with me. And unfortunately, that was the night that the German Air Force had decided they'd have a go at the indomitable. And the first bombs hit the school before the air raid sirens went, because they'd mounted the attack from Norway, transiting the north of England, rather than coming north, you see. So they'd caught the defence. The real defence was down south at that stage, you see. And so Barrow got clobbered. The upshot of it was very exciting, really, for me, I suppose, because initially I'd had all sorts of experiences, and I think I might be going on too long for these. I mean, people today would find it very hard to realise that most of these schools had become almost entirely dependent on the mothers. A lot of the staff and the younger people had been removed to fight the war or more profitable war work. I had, as a 7-year-old, going on 8-year-old, stood in the food queues with one of the mothers, all to help carry the school's provisions away and that sort of thing. And this is a nice little an anecdote that speaks 1,000 words, actually, at the time. There were two ladies behind me on one occasion, and they said one said to the other, "What's your old man doing now?" "Oh, he's down at Vickers," said the other woman. "Christ, I hope this bloody war goes on forever. They're making more money than you could believe." And the other one said, "Oh yes," she said, I keep my old man there. He's got to do his bloody overtime," and that's it. And I was hearing this, and I was totally flabbergasted. But of course, it's not always been appreciated, and it's never spoken of today. But a lot of the British community believed that it was a capitalist war, and they didn't feel fully engaged. Mm-hmm. Within a few months, they did feel fully engaged, because the trade unions, etc., all took a very different line when Soviet Russia was invaded in 1941, and of course the industrial production went up and that sort of thing. But within days of being in this queue, the first bombs fell. It didn't kill anybody. They fell, but the collapsed rubble meant that we couldn't get into the air raid shelters. So and the school was full of broken glass and all this sort of thing, as you can imagine. Big stained glass window on the staircase had been completely blown out. So the staff, largely female, carried us all down and put us under tables like that in the dining hall. And we were there. The naval guns from ships in the dockyard, etc., and the defences were firing over the top of the school. So the windows were being blasted in by the blast of gunfire. I'll never forget the sound of a naval 4.5-inch gun as long as I lived. But during the raid, I was looking, I could see my little brother Tim, and he was only 5, and I think he must have been very frightened. And the matron was there, and he was in her arms, and it was all right. When the raid was over, we were not allowed to move because the staff didn't want us to be injured, cut feet and all this sort of thing. So they carried us upstairs to bed. And it was rather exciting. I could look, there was a little hole above my bed. I mean, she literally just shook the bed like that, and all the fallen plaster fell off it and popped me in it. But I mean, it was spring 1941. The weather wasn't awful or anything like that. And so by the time we got up quite early in the morning, the organisation was such that there were buses, taxis, cars ready to evacuate us all, drawn up outside. And I hustled into a bus, and this was the worst thing. I'm sorry to say there were static water tanks around, and how it ever happened, I'll never know. But I found my little brother lying face down, dead in the water tank, 5 years old. So, there are, I suppose, relatively few people who can say they've been in action aged 5 and 8. But we were by no means alone, you know. And as it happens, the house, we were probably safer. We might both have been killed because my mother had a live-in maid, and the house that we'd rented, 9 Hawkert Lane, was bombed, and the maid lost her life anyway. So her mother and father were away, so they were. So for the rest of the war, I spent in delightful surroundings almost. They sent me to an evacuated school from Ramsgate, which was at Corton Hall near Northampton, in the middle of Northamptonshire. My mother reckoned that the nearest sea was 70 miles away, and the remaining Czech was safe enough there. Not that I saw much of her. She worked at a couple of things, and then ended up being the librarian for the Canadian forces in Britain. That's a long story, but she and her driver Molly, who was a great friend, they would go around collecting and putting together books and that sort of thing, regardless of the doodlebugs and the V2s and so on. They just drove around. Molly had a different story, but of course my mother, about that stage of the war, had lost her baby son, and she had lost her husband. So I don't suppose she was that worried about being killed on the streets of London in a car, you know. I didn't see much of her because what used to happen, I mean, I'd be in school for the 12 or 13 weeks of the term, and they'd ensure that I wrote to Mummy every Sunday and that sort of thing without fail, but the schools would cope with that. When I had to go home to Tenby for the holidays, I had a long train journey. I'd get on the train at Northampton, or Blisworth as a junction as it used to be, and down to London. Mother, or usually, but sometimes an aunt, and that would pick me up at Euston and take me across to Paddington, and then I'd get on another train, which could take as long as 7 hours to get to Tenby, and those trains were packed. And most of the service people who were younger were very thoughtful. They'd go and sit on their kit bags and things in the corridors and let the old ladies and everyone. Some of the kids, sometimes the babies, got pushed up on the luggage racks, and I remember the train being stopped on one occasion when I was quite young because they were bombing. There was a bombing threat to Cardiff, which didn't materialise at that time, and to Bristol. And they just stopped the train in the Severn Tunnel for about 20 minutes. Then grandfather Merrick Price, who was my step-grandfather, Pa, he was the town clerk, the food controller, as well as being a solicitor and so on, and seemed to do all these various tasks, but somehow he'd served the First World War in the Welsh Regiment as well. So I had Merrick Price always bathed near Goscar Rock on the North Beach, and so I could go to either grandmother's. Granny Thrupp used to make sure I got all my kit and looked after me mainly, and then Granny then Granny Merrick Price, who was formerly Granny F.B. Mason, paid the bills and sort of and so on, you see. So there you were. I was actually, of course, or thought to be the heir to FBM at that stage, but they hadn't solved the problem of they had to drop me out of the succession by deed of family arrangement in 1947, because I was 14, and by the time I was running the business, then I was a hopeless situation. You know, my grandmother, who was the trustee, and that would clearly be dead. I'm after all, she was a very good age. Now, she did last till she was 89, but I mean, she didn't really want to carry right on that long, is it? I had reached majority when she died, but not quite. So the Dennis Bancroft, my first cousin, my aunt's children, were inserted into the business succession in my place, so to speak. So there'd been great, I'd wanted to go into the Navy straight away, but there'd been great opposition by the women in my family, who said, look, enough is enough, we've lost enough men, and we don't want to lose any more. So you are not, and of course they had control till I was 21, so you are not going to go, and that is final. I asked when the 13-year-old entry at Dartmouth came up, no. Then they introduced them into, because they were changing the system, a 16-year-old entry to Dartmouth. No. Then when I was 18, I said, well, I'm going now, because they're going to call me up anyway. So she said, so